Act. So that's something you can take away from this presentation. Again, kind of looping back around, we'll be going over things to consider, right? So we've given you just a lot of information, but how can you go over that and understand the ramifications of each decision? And then we will also be using case studies to give strength to our interpretations.
For sure, yeah. And to help us all kind of contextualize and apply the knowledge that we've learned. Yeah. Awesome. So just so we're all on the same page, we wanted to start with some key terms. These are likely familiar to most, if not all of you, but we'll get into it. So disability includes a physical, mental, psychiatric, or learning impairment that permanently affects your functioning in multiple areas of your life, typically. For the purpose of this presentation, we will be flipping back and forth between the terms mental illness and disability. That's not to imply necessarily that those are the same, but it's because the process and the protections that are in place for folks who are disclosing are the same regardless. We also have been having really interesting conversations about how a lot of youth don't even recognize maybe that mental illness can qualify as a disability and that they would be eligible for accommodations at work. So we are kind of intentional about focusing on mental health or framing things in that way. Yeah. Disclosure is telling someone about your disability or mental illness. So it's the act of doing that. And it can be anyone, it doesn't necessarily need to be at work. Accommodations are a change, a tool, or a support that's put in place to help mitigate or minimize some barriers or challenges that may result as a result of someone's condition or disability or mental illness. And we will talk at length about accommodations, how to access those, and all the different types of accommodations that are available for folks a little bit later.
The next thing we want to talk about is the Nova Scotia kind of, oh, sorry, maybe I'll read this first, and I think the next one is actually this. But we've kind of already said this, physical and mental disabilities are protected characteristics under the Human Rights Act, which means any violations of those are human rights violations. Right, so this, I'm sure, is a visual aid that you've seen before or something similar. This is the equality versus equity visual aid. So this one I really, really like because I found one with a wheelchair and a ramp, which is one that I hadn't seen before, as opposed to having different boxes. Sort of the reason we wanted to share this is describing the need for accommodations that support an equitable ability to work and use resources. Equity can be overlooked as we strive for equality, and there are lots of accommodations that are invisible because we are so used to them, like using a chair to sit or even an ergonomic chair to support physical well-being. So it's just sort of a reminder to look around you and see how can we continue to grow and support everyone as well as we can possibly.
Yeah. So when it comes to inclusion at work and specifically mental illness and disability in the workplace, we were discussing the socio-ecological model. So that's what we're kind of looking at here. So our presentation will focus mainly on the individual level, because that's where we as career practitioners tend to have the most level of influence. So that's where we can discuss with youth, prepare them for these conversations, and kind of provide support in discussing with their manager or supervisor. So that's where we're going to focus on for the most part. We're also really passionate about bringing this message to the community. So we are kind of addressing that on this level and discussing with our community of practice and sharing with different kind of forums. And then institutionally, we're really excited to be bringing this presentation to a group of employers in July. I don't think we have a link for that one yet, but we will be sure to share that if you know of any employers who could benefit from having this or who are interested in receiving this information. Clearly, there's lots of work to be done in our society to make inclusive workspaces. So we're just trying to do our small part to influence that. All right, so we're going to dive into youth rights and responsibilities at work first. So youth are responsible for communicating with their employer with regards to absences, any challenges that they might be having, whether it's performance or interactions with coworkers or customers. So that responsibility falls on the youth to bring these concerns or questions to their supervisor kind of as they come up. And in relation to their mental illness or disability, ideally, we want to encourage youth to open the conversation before any issues arise. We'll get into this a bit later, but it helps kind of mitigate any miscommunication or their manager, supervisor attributing their behaviors to other things. So there are situations where youth would have to let their manager know, so it's required. So this is primarily if their disability creates a health and safety risk for themselves or their coworkers. So this is particularly relevant, let's say, in the construction industry, if there were, some like sensory motor issues that could impact their use of power tools or things like that. There are also some other circumstances. We can give more examples if you're curious. And then also, youth are required to let their managers know or provide some additional information if they require accommodations. So of course, every person at work has the right to request accommodations, and then in turn, employers have the right to ask for more info in order to provide appropriate supports.
So I'll jump in with the other side of these things, the employer's responsibilities. So as a youth or any employee discloses and asks for accommodations, employers are not allowed to ask a youth if they have a disability without reason, right? They can ask questions about the youth's ability to do certain tasks, as any employer can to any employee, and for medical documentation, if you're asking for an accommodation, right? So they might be asking sort of for proof, which would come from medical documentation. So yeah, okay, good. So employers have to do what they can for youth to get their get or keep their job, right? Disability cannot be or should not be a barrier to employment or disability or mental illness. So this can include needing to offer accommodations that would enable equity and inclusion in the workplace. We also sort of wanted to bring up that this may include a new disability, an acquired disability. So that might include offering a different position from the one that they held previously. So we also want to make sure that youth are aware of that as a right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I guess also, yes, very good. So because of that, we want to say, sorry, this is our first time being in control of the PowerPoint. So, yeah, so when when you are disclosing a disability, you still have the right to privacy, right? And an employer can't continue to ask you invasive questions, and you have the right to share as much or as little information as necessary to get the accommodations you need. And as a youth, these are the kinds of things when you're getting your first position you might not be aware of, and the things that we can pass along as practitioners working with youth. So part of that is an employer can use undue hardship as a reason to not provide accommodation. And the reason we want to bring this up is this is an important piece of accommodation for accommodation purposes, as it's primarily a monetary, right? A monetary barrier. So a large organization cannot say undue hardship. This would more be if it's you know, a small business, a mom and pop who does not have the ability to do renovations or to buy more equipment. And we'll kind of go into ways that we can get around that. There are, you know, some grants and some organizations that they could reach out to take that barrier down. But yeah, we also wanted to go into this example. 𝐏𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞 works in a warehouse and is responsible for loading and unloading up to 60-pound boxes. She has a back condition that is making it difficult for her to complete these tasks without intense pain. So we are asking you to pop in the chat or unmute yourselves and give us your perspective of what actions her manager could take. Maybe I will give some examples. This might be a time, especially if it's, oh, sorry.
There's some answers start coming in.
Great, okay. Pallet jack, yes, that's the first thing that came to my mind, right? Yeah, that's almost an invisible accommodation, right? To labor standards that you need a pallet jack if you're being asked to move extremely heavy things.
A back brace, yes. And
yeah.
Scheduled breaks. Forklift.
Train her some on equipment, yeah.
Back brace. Yeah, these are some great suggestions. Yeah. Ask 𝐏𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞. Thank you, Lisa, for bringing it back to asking the client. Training on proper lifting. Yeah, definitely.
We also wanted to, exactly, yes. What inclusive accommodations can we make for all people? And especially not singling out one person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some amazing suggestions, and a good bulk of these suggestions are low cost, and even some of them are no cost, which is important. Yep, bring it back to the medical professional, job sharing, duties, lighter boxes. Yeah, some really great suggestions. Thank you, everybody.
We also sort of wanted to say that if this is one of these things where as a youth may choose to disclose to one person over another, if the manager is not aware of all of these accessibility availability, they could reach out to someone like HR and ask for more education. You know, it doesn't mean that the employer has to brainstorm all of these things by themselves, but could reach out and get more education, but also asking 𝐏𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞 what her experience is.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Before we move forward to the next slide, I just want to address a couple of questions that came up in the chat box. Are youth expected to prove what disability they claim? Like, will they need a doctor's note? So depending on the accommodation that they're requesting, employers typically will ask for a note of some sort. This could be, it could span anything from just like a quick note from a family doctor, or I know those are hard to find, but a walk-in clinic sometimes will do notes like that. Also a psych ed assessment, if it's more on the psychological cognitive level, would serve as proof. And those don't necessarily need to be provided to the manager either. Those can be provided to HR for confidentiality purposes. Just wanted to point that out. There was also another question, unless you have something to add to that, Maggie, feel free.
No, that's exactly what I would have said.
Okay.
I would have said. I guess we'll kind of come up and talk about this further. Don't provide more than what you're being asked to provide. Answer the question that is being asked of you, unless you want to provide more.
Yeah. Tara also had a question that we passed here. As employment support practitioners, what are responsibilities if an individual is not disclosing a health or safety issue?
As practitioners, what is our responsibility?
Yeah, what is our rule around that?
My interpretation of that is my responsibility is to my client, and maybe that is an ongoing conversation of why or why not disclosure is happening, and asking what advocacy or self-advocacy we can work together to support for that client.
Mm-hmm. Our confidentiality policy at Phoenix is quite strict, but there is the limitation of if this person was at risk of harming themselves or others. So it may fall under that limitation depending on the severity of risk. So that's something that as a practitioner, I would encourage you to discuss with your manager and possibly with someone from your professional practice body if there is one. So for example, I'm registered with the College of Social Work, so I might seek advice from them around disclosing prior to doing that. Yeah. Any other questions before we move forward? Thank you for all your suggestions.
There was actually one more question, Janelle, where someone asks, what are the supervisor's limits to helping when a youth comes forth with barriers?
Yes, so that one was addressed under duty to accommodate, I believe. But if there's outstanding questions around that one. Yeah.
And the question is under sort of reasonable accommodation. How, and it goes back to equity, everyone knows what I'm trying to say. And how can you create an inclusive workspace for everyone? And it is the duty of the employer to go as far as they possibly can under that.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. All right, so we may not know what accommodations might be helpful or necessary. As career practitioners, we're not expected to be experts on every condition or disability. Thankfully, this amazing resource exists from the Job Accommodations Network. It's called SOAR, and it's essentially a searchable database for accommodations. So you can either search by diagnosis, you can search by work task, you can search by functional limitation. It's a really great resource to have. So it's linked in the resources for this session, which Joel, I believe, can drop into the chat. It's really great. So as an example, you can look up something like PTSD, for example, in this searchable database, and it will give you a list of potential accommodations. So it's a really great starting point when you're working with a youth who is maybe newly diagnosed or is new to working and isn't quite sure what might be helpful. So it's a fantastic resource. I really hope that you check it out and click around. So we also wanted to include a few examples of accommodations, with which I think Maggie is going to go into some of these right now.
And again, this is not an exhaustive list at all. These are even just sort of the first things that popped into our brain when we were talking about this. Adapted physical space, right? To make it wheelchair accessible in the physical space. That's sort of an easy change a lot of the time. Maybe it's moving a desk or creating a wider pathway, right? An exercise task chair. So that's sort of under adapted physical space. Communication aids, making a quiet space available, or the use of noise canceling headphones. This isn't necessarily that the employer needs to provide the noise canceling headphones, but create a space where it's accessible to use them.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Additional check-ins with the supervisor or HR, and then modified duties or work hours. This could be schedule adjustments or a hybrid option, working from home. It's all very individualized and up to the employee, the youth. Technical aids, computer, laptop, or tablet, with specialized software. This might be voice to text, and or Bluetooth adapted hearing aids. If anyone can come up with anything else, you're welcome to throw those in the chat as well.
Yeah. Also, we just wanted to chat about where to access accommodations that cost money. So we can definitely refer youth to agencies or resources for these accommodations. To plug our own agencies, some great agencies you can connect with are Teamwork or Phoenix, but also we know there's amazing resources in our community in Halifax, and I know that these exist in other places as well. So for example, Autism Nova Scotia, Job Junction, Reachability. You can also reach out to some disability specific organizations for some of these supports, such as CNIB for visual accommodations, Easter Seals, other ones like that, just to name a couple. And we also want to work with youth to have conversations around self-advocacy, and that having equitable access to employment is their right, and that they're not being a quote unquote special snowflake if they're seeking these accommodations and supports. It's necessary for them to be successful and happy and comfortable at work. Thank you, Marie-Josée, for the accommodation examples there. Definitely. All right. So moving into a discussion on whether or not youth should disclose. So we really want to make clear that we are not pro-disclosure all of the time for everyone. Disclosure is a really personal choice. And it's our job as career practitioners to help youth make an informed decision, right? So we want to present them kind of all of the different factors and things to consider so that they make up their own minds about it. So we are really curious as to what you think might be some pros to disclosing. So if you want to share those, you can pop those in the chat right now. So what would be some positives of disclosing your disability or mental illness in the workplace? There are many. There's no wrong answers either.
Or if you feel more comfortable, you can take yourself off mute.
Yes.
As well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Context, yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, like these ones that point to a shift in culture and making it more accessible for everyone.
Yes.
The people that follow them.
Oh, I love that perspective, showing that you want to succeed at the job and that you're sharing something that could hinder your success possibly. Absolutely. Lots of comments around misinterpretation of behavior, which we are definitely going to address that in more depth. Yes, absolutely.
Asking for what you need. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you everyone for these. These are great pros. Transparency, not feeling left out. Yeah, absolutely. Amazing. All right, so we were on the same wavelength here with our pros. So we're gonna kind of talk about them one by one, and then we'll get into some of the cons as well.
So maybe I'll start. Great. So exactly really what we've heard already. Reduce stress of not having to mask or hide or conform or fit in. That can be so stressful. I'm speaking from my personal experience, to have to explain away symptoms of depression or mental illness. These things can add to the stress of having a disability. Access to accommodations, right? It just is so much easier to have transparent communication if you are asking for accommodation, because the why is already handled. I need this thing because this is happening. Open communication with manager, right? It creates a better flow of communication, a better working relationship with your manager, most of the time, right? That's the potential con, which we will talk about, but the hope is that it creates a safe space where you can continue these conversations with your manager or whoever you choose to disclose to. And because of that, it might be your coworkers, it might be HR, it might be a friend in another organization who's going through a similar thing. And yeah, that's sort of all these things that bring confidence, bring support to youth when they are disclosing, and bring a positive to the experience.
Absolutely, I agree 100%. It also would allow you to involve other support people. So it may mean that you get more involved as a career practitioner in helping kind of mediate discussions with the supervisor, or other counselors, physicians, job coaches. So it kind of opens that door to that as well. Any other pros you wanted to add, Maggie, or should we move on?
I mean, there are more pros, right?
There are many.
There are many pros. If you are disclosing to another person, this is sort of something that is encompassing of this, but if you're disclosing to another person, it might create stability for that other person, enable them to ask for more of what they need, and solidarity in that. And then that's, again, better working relationships with the people around you, and change of the organization as a whole.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah.
All right, now for the cons. If you guys want to pop some in the chat, we would love to hear where your head's at with those. So any kind of disadvantages or risks of disclosing? Oh, before we get into that, Lynn mentioned having a positive reputation building for the organization itself to build on the pros. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Too many.
Yeah, absolutely. Stigma, risk of discrimination, being judged, being fired, being singled out.
Preferred treatment from coworkers, that special snowflake judgment.
Mm. And I know that there are some of you as well in the audience today who have had these conversations with your own manager and have kind of weighed these pros and cons for yourselves. So I see you, and yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Fear of becoming a burden, for sure. We recognize we're sort of preaching to the choir here, right?
Yes.
And you're able to come up with tokenism, right? Because you either may potentially yourself experience it, or when you're working with youth, these are the things that bring shame, bring fear to the potential of disclosing, and are completely valid.
Yes, all of these are very real, and their effects cannot be kind of overstated.
And also, it is some of the time a sort of potential floodgate situation where you can't really take it back, right? If you disclose, it's hard to undo that. So it's always a huge decision to take that first step.
Mm-hmm. And we will talk about this when we get into the disclosure plan, but it's always an option as well to, I think Maggie, you said this earlier, to disclose a little bit and see what the reaction is, and then kind of disclose a bit more as you gauge the response. So we won't spend too much time on these cons because, like Maggie said, we're all kind of well-versed in what these might be and what the risks are. We just wanted to point out a few in particular that we feel may be relevant. So being embarrassed or anxious, overlooked for promotions, being treated differently, or conflicting feelings of identity. Maggie, do you have anything to add for the cons? Or to dive into?
Yeah, Calvin, you've mentioned sheltered workshop, that concern that you don't belong in employment, that you don't belong sort of where you're capable. And yeah, there's Catherine, I really like that as well. You don't necessarily have the words all the time as youth. I think Janelle and I are coming from this perspective of this is either your first job or your first time in continuous employment potentially, and you don't always have, I'm saying you, I as a youth, that's where this is coming a lot of the time, did not have the words to describe how I needed to be treated, and that was something that we had to learn along the way.
Absolutely. All right, so we want to talk about, thank you for all of your participation with the cons as well. We just want to spend a little bit of time talking about intersectionality, which is a term that was brought forward or invented by 𝐏𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐬 𝐁𝐢𝐨𝐬, a Black lawyer and scholar from the States. And it discusses kind of the interconnected nature of our social categories or our social identities. So many youth hold multiple marginalized identities, and this can affect their willingness, safety, comfort in disclosing at work. They may also have mistrust in management or, in workplaces as a whole due to, and rightfully so, due to mistreatment and discrimination that they or the people that they love have experienced. So we just wanted to acknowledge that as very real, as a very real risk for many youth. Maggie and I, as you know, white people have that kind of racial privilege, and so it may be safer for us to disclose in the workplace. So I just want to acknowledge that as well. And further to that point, many youth already experience discrimination at work, and it takes an incredible mental and emotional toll. So we work with youth regularly who experience racism specifically at work, and how that impacts the youth is just it's terrible to see, and terrible for them to experience. So they may be at a higher risk of experiencing adverse outcomes at work as a result of disclosure. So we just need to acknowledge that. And also some symptoms of neurodivergence, for example, like ADHD and also autism, may be misinterpreted. So this may result in a safety issue for some youth, in particular Black youth, as we have seen stories in the news, and we may know some people who have outwardly stimming behaviors or visually stimming behaviors, which then gets misinterpreted by law enforcement or by other people as, you know, aggressive or dangerous. So yeah, these are very real issues that we just need to consider when we're having these conversations with youth about disclosure. Any comments or questions around that? Thank you, Danielle. Yeah, this entire process can be used for adults, youth, seniors in the workplace. All right. I think we're good to move on.
So this is actually maybe one of my favorite slides. It's find your people, which is something that's I think is so difficult to acknowledge how that impacts your job, right? I think a lot of the time you want to come in and be very professional and especially as a youth, and you really want to be independent. But something that Janelle and I felt was really important when you're trying to recognize, is this an inclusive workspace? Am I going to have my rights upheld? How hard is it going to be for me to ask for accommodations? So the kind of almost first step that might be available to youth is to find people around them that are going to give them that solidarity, give them that confidence to move forward in their disclosure process if they haven't done it before starting. And this can be, you know, people in their same age group. It could be your manager, it could be peers or people on the same, you know, level of experience as them, but it can be the manager who also shares and has a disability. You know, it sort of find that unlikely source of support within your organization so that you do not feel so alone, singled out or snowflaked. Make those relationships at work so that you can move forward. Yeah.
All right, so discussing when to disclose. So there's lots of different opportunities that youth might have to disclose. They're all up on the screen here. So either before or during the interview, when the offer is signed, or during orientation, or after the youth has worked there for a while. All of these are valid and okay times to disclose. Oftentimes we find that youth with more visible disabilities or mental illness symptoms tend to have most favorable outcomes when they disclose early to prevent any kind of misunderstanding, but that's not always the case. I find that most of the work that I work with tend to choose number 3 and disclose after they have more of a comfort level built up, a little bit more trust with the employer.
It can also mean that maybe you need to almost redisclose if there's maybe a new manager or yeah, just a change in employment. Maybe a new person has come join the organization. And it doesn't mean that you're lying or hiding or anything like that. It means that you're choosing your safety and the best time for you to disclose.
Definitely. All right.
Yes, new staff can generate new issues if they aren't onboarded as previous staff were. That is completely correct.
Good point.
Yeah, so it may be up to the youth if it's not part of the orientation process, which from a manager's perspective, that can be a tricky conversation because you don't want to speak for someone else and you don't want to overshare someone else's disability or accommodation needs. So it may very well be up to the youth to repeatedly disclose and orient new people to their needs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So now we're into the meat of it, getting into step-by-step how to disclose. Maggie, I will let you take it away.
So I know that Joel has put the SharePoint in the chat. So if anybody wants to go, we do have the handout available in there that you can go see it as well. But I'm just going to go step by step the disclosure process that we thought could be valuable. So yeah. These are steps you can go over with the youth as they prepare to disclose at any step of the employment process. Youth who have a plan of disclosing are more likely to have a positive, constructive conversation with their manager, right? So the first step we determined was define your mental illness or disability, right? Be as specific or general as you want. Use specific medical terms or things that are on your documentation, and ask for the employer to educate themselves or share what is specifically about you and to your individuality. Remind your employer, explain how it could affect your job. Answer the questions being asked, right? I already said that. And don't overshare. That's something that we really wanted to point out, and we'll go kind of over a little bit as I go through these steps. But answer the question that's being asked of you, and only share what you're comfortable with. So suggest ways that can support you. Remind your employer of your strengths, skills, and excitement for the job. Here's why I'm a good candidate, especially in the interview process. These might be sort of a good thing to share, that you're excited about the job as a youth to start the new job. This is an exciting opportunity. You want to learn and grow. Here's how you can best be supported to do that. We did sort of just talk about this. This is an ongoing conversation, most likely. It may be an ongoing conversation with the same people, it might be an ongoing conversation with new people. But check back to make sure that everyone is continuously on the same page about everything that you've shared.
Yeah. So just oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to go sort of back to the definition of your mental illness. This can be as specific or as vague as you want, right? You can go specifically into your definition when you're discussing with a youth what they want to share. Give them a little bit of maybe take some time to go over what they feel comfortable explaining about their disability or mental illness, how they say it in plain terms, or when they're explaining it to any new person. And they can practice that before they go over it with their employer.
All right, good to move to the next one.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah.
Okay, so here is our handout that we created for the disclosure plan. So our goal for this is for you to actually print them and use them with the youth that you work with. I recently led this presentation with a very small group of youth in an employment program that I was doing. And as soon as I let them know there was a handout, they had their heads down and were filling it out immediately. So feel free to print these off and use them to help guide your conversations or to give them to the youth to use on their own if they're more comfortable that way. I came across a really interesting piece of information from research. So there was a systematic review that was done on the literature about disclosing at work. And it found that for youth with disabilities, they were 4.9% more likely to have a positive employment outcome when they had a disclosure plan. So it's just evidence that practicing these conversations can really impact the outcomes for the youth. And that's what we're kind of focused on. So I want to draw your attention to, oops, sorry. So yeah, the signs or symptoms that could show up at work. So this is a really good conversation starter because youth may think, as someone mentioned in the chat, that their mental illness doesn't show up at work at all, but actually in conversation, you discover that it does. So here's where you can help the youth come up with some signs or symptoms that could show up at work. And then some potential job tasks that could be challenging. So you also might want to put in here some environmental concerns. So for example, if strong smells are difficult for them or challenging for them, put that in here. That's something they can talk to their workplace about. You also might want to put in number 5, some specific behaviors and coping strategies that the youth already uses and finds helpful. So even if they don't need support with something, it may be helpful to tell their employer, hey, this is what I've been doing and it really helps me cope. So for example, youth might say, because of my ADHD, I find it hard to concentrate when there's lots of people kind of hanging around my work area. Would it be okay if I use noise canceling headphones sometimes? I really find that helpful. Or sometimes a short walk kind of helps me get refocused. So just really coming with solutions already, at least a couple of suggestions will help with the conversation and show initiative as well. Other things for possible accommodations or supports that you can also do is encourage the youth to talk to their manager about how they like to be approached with questions or concerns about their performance. I know some managers are bad for calling people out in front of coworkers, which can be particularly damaging and isolating for a lot of youth. So if at all possible, a lot of youth may prefer to be approached privately for performance-related issues. So that's a request that they can make. And then finally, things to avoid mentioning for now. So Maggie and I have had many conversations about youth's tendencies to overshare, which, you know, speaks to the relationship that a lot of you also have with your clients, right? Like they feel very comfortable with you a lot of the time and want to share and want to connect. And that's really great. And we want to kind of protect that, but also let youth know that their supervisor or manager is a different type of relationship, different type of supportive person in their life. So differentiating those roles, I think, might be helpful for some youth. And sometimes, oh yeah, go ahead.
And continuing to give that space where, you know, maybe having access to you who already has this relationship, who has a lot of background information potentially, to go over or talk through some issues or concerns or whatever that they want to go over with their boss or manager before that, to maybe practice language, practice what is exactly you want to convey, what is the message that you're trying to get across, and what are you asking for, and so that you can prepare as a youth to go in to talk and have the best outcome.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, some of us have been there where we have also overshared and then experienced kind of a vulnerability hangover afterwards of, wow, did I just share all of that with this person, right? Like that's a very relatable experience. So you can kind of use that if you've experienced that yourself to talk to the youth, and then discuss some very specific strategies that the youth can use to kind of intercept that. If they feel themselves starting to veer into word vomit territory, right? We want to avoid that. So, you know, grounding themselves, checking in with themselves. If they notice they've been talking for a long period of time, then maybe taking a pause. Another strategy could be if they have a support person with them when they're having that conversation, which is also allowed. You're allowed to ask for that. Then maybe the support person could do a tactile thing. So touching them on the shoulder when they notice them, like, you know, going a little bit too far. So, yeah, those are just some strategies to stop that train, because, you know, their employer doesn't need to know they've been crying on the floor in the bathroom for the last half an hour, you know, or at home on a Saturday night. Like that is just an overshare, right? So helping the youth create those boundaries.
The crying in the office that
Right.
can result from that.
Right.
You know, how can we what language can we give to youth to come to a meeting where they say, I am feeling very vulnerable, I am feeling very emotional right now, and I may not convey the information that I want to all in this meeting, but I have information that I need to share with you, and maybe this means we need to have a meeting in a couple days after to refocus. Yeah, so to convey those options to a youth, so that they do not feel like they need to share everything all at once and then have that emotional hangover.
Yeah. All right, any questions about this template? So it is in the OneDrive. Joel did link it in the chat if you missed that. So please go and feel free to download it. It can be used by anyone. You don't have to be a case manager or an employment support practitioner. Yeah, feel free to make use of it. All right, and breathe. That is a lot of information. It's a huge process to discuss with one's employer. Mental health. So reminding youth to just take their time, slow down, breathe. Yeah, it's important.
All right. So we're going to go into things to consider. But first, we want to ask a question of you again. What concerns might a supervisor have when someone discloses a disability or mental illness? It's a great question, but maybe you have had them from your own personal perspective, or you as a manager have had them when someone has disclosed to you. So throw those in the chat. Yeah, the liability.
Absolutely. Yeah, all of those are great ones. Saying and doing the right thing, not understanding the needs of the employee, fear, liability, work performance.
Yeah, I like their impact on the person's performance. How is the, again, culture of the workplace creating a safe space for everyone?
Yeah. Absolutely. Worried about how to support them. I love that perspective, because sometimes I think when we're having conversations about disclosure, it's like the big bad employer and the youth needs to do all this self-advocacy, right? But in some cases, there are really supportive employers out there, but they just may not have the tools that they need in order to support the youth. So that's what we're hoping to do with our presentation in July, that's targeted towards employers, is to help employers kind of navigate that. Management style, overwhelmed and understaffed already. Definitely, definitely. Yeah, thank you for all those suggestions. All of those definitely will play into it. So the biggest thing that we have found is that employers often misunderstand employees' behavior. So they might assume that an employee has a bad attitude or, doesn't have a valid reason for missing work. And as a result, the manager approaches the youth as if it's a disciplinary issue, as opposed to coming at it from a curious perspective of, hey, what's going on, So youth in this case may want to kind of get a feel for how a manager might react before disclosing first. So there's a few different ways that they can do that. So they can, observe how the manager has reacted to other people disclosing, seeing their reaction to different news stories, getting more info about employers' mental health policies, those kinds of things. The manager might have concerns about their lack of mental health knowledge. While, discussing mental health is more mainstream now in the media and such, there's still a lot of gaps around particular diagnoses and conditions, and still a lot of misinformation. Personality disorders is always the one that kind of comes to my mind. There's a lot of really negative stigma around personality disorders and lack of knowledge there. So the youth can direct their manager to websites, resources, brochures, encouraging a youth to kind of deepen their own knowledge about their diagnosis can help them explain to their employer how it shows up for them. Employers, as a few of you mentioned, are often afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing or doing something quote unquote illegal. So for this reason, they may not say something when they see someone is struggling. So that's something to consider. Privacy and confidentiality, I already kind of mentioned that with the illegal comment, but they may not be aware of the rules and regulations, might be worried about violating their human rights or invading privacy or making things worse for the employee at work. And then many of the comments also focused on productivity or usability to do their job. Attendance and reliability is often a big concern for employers as well, and is often, I would say, I don't know if you'd agree, Maggie, but like the thing that gets misinterpreted the most at work is the absences and the lateness.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And I think, that's the kind of thing we can have these preemptive conversations with youth. How do you communicate your absences or communicate, lateness or whatever, which are symptoms of your mental illness potentially? Are there policies that you need to follow? Is there already a strategy in place that other, that's just in the culture of the workplace? How can you be upfront and communicate as a youth to your employer?
Definitely. All right, shall we move to the next one?
Yes, please. Yeah, so you want to talk about your comfort and safety at work. Is this okay? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Your comfort and safety at work. So as we're talking to youth, we always want to make sure that we're trying to create a scenario of success, right? That's what we're all working towards. So put that decision-making power in the hands of the youth. They get to decide when, if, how they want to share, right? Who they're sharing to, and consider how their identities have been acknowledged or respected or not, right? So go back to that intersectionality. What have they already come across before disclosing this new piece of themselves, which may make them feel comfortable and safe or not within the workplace. Did already touch on this, but go over your strengths and skills. Remind them you've been hired, right? You've been asked to do this job because they believe you can do the job. So reiterate those things and why the youth are excited to have this employment opportunity. What skills have youth gained from their mental illness or disability? What makes them unique as an individual with their own experiences as any other employee has? What can they bring to the table in a way that maybe someone else doesn't, because they've learned how to accommodate themselves, how to contextualize themselves? What do they already know to share? Yeah, identify benefits and supports available at work or in the community. Support with funding and accommodations available. Again, that goes back to maybe tooting our own horn again. What grants or funding are available from our organizations and or other community supports. So as I went back to say, in the finding your people being maybe one of my favorite things, having that strength and confidence from solidarity, from someone else knowing your struggle can be so beneficial, right? Even as Janelle and I are preparing for these presentations, it's that strength that we're two people presenting our something that we're so passionate about that makes me able to do this, right? As that kind of sounds corny, but it's very, very true. Is there someone that you found that you can have a pep talk or a strategy session with before you, like in your workplace as a youth, before you go into a larger meeting with your manager, with someone who makes you maybe intimidated or you have to be your best self with, right? Is there someone in your organization that can stand beside you in that meeting that you can ask to come with you to reassure or redirect, or Janelle already mentioned this, to have that physical or verbal cue if you're starting to word vomit, if you're starting to overshare, can you have that conversation beforehand to say, this is what I need help with, can you help me? So that's sort of something that a youth, and as we're talking to youth, we can indicate that they can lay that groundwork as they're coming up to the decision to disclose or ask for additional accommodations, or maybe going to recognize that their accommodations are not being supported in the workplace and needing to have that conversation.
Yes, thank you all. Hope you have a wonderful day.